Let me ask you something. Do you believe that when we read Scripture, we should strive to understand it in a way that the original authors would have understood it? Should we interpret it through their eyes, their language, their culture, their worldview? Now, I think most of us would say, yeah, that would be the best way to understand what the Bible's saying, to understand what it's meant to be telling us, right? And so we should be asking, what did this mean to the people who first wrote it, who read it, who lived it, right? How did they think? What were their assumptions, their expectations, their norms? After all, the Bible wasn't written in English. It wasn't written in our modern scientific categories or Western culture expectations. It was written by ancient people in an ancient language within an ancient context. Now, to some, maybe this might be shocking, but really, this shouldn't be. It's a fact. We do this all the time with other important documents. A good example of this is the Constitution. There are many who arguably and rightfully, I believe, that believe what they do is that we want to really understand a particular amendment that's in the Constitution. We shouldn't be reinterpreting it through our modern political trends, language, or politics. We need to actually be going back to what the founders who wrote that amendment said. What were they saying in their time? What were those words? What did those words, the definitions of those words meant at the time? Because definitions do change over time. Again, a really good example from the Constitution is the Second Amendment. And you've probably heard the phrase all the time, a well-regulated militia. It's a line that has stirred no end of debate, right? Some have used it even to argue that only formal military groups should have the right to bear arms, not individual citizens. After all, that's what a militia means. But if we stop to actually read the whole sentence, we'll notice such strange things as how the amendment isn't just talking about the amendment, it's also talking about the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and that it shall not be infringed. So, which is it, militia or the people, right? This is really where history or understanding history matters. When people today hear the word well-regulated militia, they're picturing a government-run force, a state supervision, rules and red tape. Back then, well regulated didn't mean what it does now. Its definition was different. It meant controlled. It meant in good working order, equipped, supplied, maintained. The militia wasn't a government body. It was the people themselves, citizens ready and able to defend their communities. So when the founders wrote this, they weren't drawing a line between the militia and the people. They were equating the two. The militia was the people, and the right to bear arms was something that the people should not have infringed, right? Why do I bring this up in this militia? Why is this important? Because just like how linguistic drift and cultures have changed our understanding of the Constitution, which was only written a few hundred years ago and still in the same language, the same thing also happened with the Bible. Words shift meaning, culture, ideas, they all evolved. And if we don't take the time to understand Scripture in its own context, we may walk away with something that sounds right in our modern ear, but it isn't what the text is actually saying, which sadly has given rise to such things that we see as the young earth creationist. So let's go ahead. We're going to look at Genesis 1:1. And now, most English translations, especially since the original King James Bible came out, renders it as in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. Now, the New King James Version, it's the way it sounds. I use the New King James Version, but the way it's written in the beginning, this sounds like a standalone absolute starting point. God created everything from nothing in a single moment, a cosmic Big Bang, if you will. Sorry, there's a very loud car going by. But anyways, but what if this isn't right? I don't believe it is, and many scholars nowadays are learning it's not right. And the more accurate translation isn't in the beginning, but instead is when God began to create the heavens and earth. Now, this might sound like something small, trivial, but in reality, this shifts the whole structure. Now, verse 1 is no longer an independent sentence. It's actually the first part of a story, a setup. It connects verse 1 to verse 2. And so we have, instead of in the beginning, we have when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void. So the focus is no longer on the absolute beginning of all things, but on what God did in the midst of what was already existing, a disordered world. It doesn't mean that God didn't create everything, but it would suggest that the Bible itself is starting where things are already made. Before I get into the details of the language used, let me start out outside the Bible with history, the language used around there, the world in which Genesis was written in. We'll go with that, right? Genesis itself, it wasn't written in a vacuum. It came out of an ancient Near Eastern world, a world that was filled with other creation stories from cultures like Babylon and Egypt, and nearly all of them, they didn't begin with nothing, but instead they began with chaos. So this kind of shows what the people were thinking back then. So if we take the creation myth, the Enom, I think Enom, I'm probably slaughtering that. I'm trying to go off of memory there. But anyways, it starts not with the creation of matter or all things, but instead it's starting with a disordered, watery abyss. The gods didn't create matter. No, they instead had the story where it was bringing order to what was already there. Right? The Egyptians themselves had a similar idea. The earth rose out of a watery chaos called Nun. Again, the focus wasn't on making matter from nothing, but on establishing function and order in a world that had no structure. And here's the thing, these stories, again, they didn't begin with in the beginning like we find in many translations of the Bible. Instead, they began with a temporal cause, with a when statement. Like, when on high no name was given to the heavens, or when there was no dry land, the darkness covered the waters, right? So this at this time was a standard way writers opened creation stories at the time. And Genesis 1:1 uses the same Hebrew construct, Bereshit. Literally, or more precisely anyways, it means when beginning. There's no definite article. You won't find the word the in there. It doesn't say in the beginning. It's simply, in the most direct way it could be translated, is when beginning. And this is revealing because it's pointing us towards a process that was already in motion. So historically, culturally, and linguistically, the Hebrew word itself lines up with the ancient Near Eastern when formula, and not so much the modern version of in the beginning interpretation we tend to have in our Bibles, right? Most of them. Many Bibles have now changed, by the way. I should mention that many of them are updating and updating it to when, and some are including a footnote. Maybe they just like, we got to be honest, but we like this because we got to keep the younger creationists happy. They buy a lot of Bibles. But anyways, so they're including it, and we're starting to see this as becoming the accepted view. But that's not really all. We can find evidence further in the Bible itself. First, let's excuse me. Let's look at the Hebrew grammar. Many scholars have pointed out lack, or at least a grammatical feature that we'd expect in a standalone sentence, a definite article, at least in the Hebrew, right? If the author meant to say the beginning, he would have used Bereshit with a article ha attached to it. But it's not there. It's Bereshit by itself, and that is translated, it's when beginning, not in the beginning. And second, the Hebrew syntax itself, it strongly is supporting a dependence clause reading, right? The grammar of verse 1, it aligns with an independent sentence, but with what is called a circumstantial clause. Now, this is a type of Hebrew sentence used to tell us what is coming next, right? And we can see this in the same structure in the Bible, such as in Job chapter 8, verse 7, or Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 1. It's where it's saying, in the beginning, the reign of Zechariah. It's not referring to the start of a existence. Everything didn't exist at that time and then popped in. No, it was a starting period within a already existing reign. And that's what we find in Genesis 1:1. It's using the same construct. Not the start of everything, but a start in the moment of time when God began his work. Now this ties to Genesis 1:2, right? Verse 2, where if we read it in whole now, it says, the earth was formless and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep. The phrase without form and void, right? What we have in our Bible translations, without form and void, the Hebrew word is tohi vabahu, right? In Genesis verse 2, it's indicating a state of unproductive chaos. Again, In the ancient Near East culture's context, this terminology it's reflecting a world that's not yet ordered or functional. Tohu itself, a formless, and bohu, a void, are often used to describe desolate and uninhabitable places and unproductive conditions, right? So we can find this in Isaiah verse 45, chapter 18, and similarly in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10, when we find that it's talking about a desert land, a wasteland, and howling wilderness that's encircling someone, right? And he's kept him as an apple of his eye. It's referring to a barren wasteland. So when Bohu appears alongside Tohu in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23, when it says, I behold the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light. It's describing the land after the devastation of Babylon. This only really further emphasizes what it's really meaning, a desolate place, not a exact beginning. In various ancient texts, Tohu itself is referring to wilderness or wastelands where nothing is productive. Nothing, at least productive, occurs. And bohu, again, it's being used in conjunction with tohu, which is emphasizing this lack of structure. Excuse me, I need a drink. The use of tohu v bohu in verse 2 would then have been really understood by the ancient audiences as describing a chaotic state that is devoid of order and purpose. Ancient Near Eastern creation myths, such as the Elish, often depict creation as bringing order from a primal chaos, similar to Tohu v Bohu, right? Such as the Babylonian god guy. He creates this world by subduing the chaotic sea goddess. It's like a dragon creature or something, but it symbolizes the establishment of order from chaos, and that's what he did to do that. And therefore, the description of earth as without form and void is setting the stage for God's creative work, where he's assigning roles and functions and transforming this chaotic and unproductive state into an ordered and purposeful world. And this, like we have in the Bible here, it's reflecting the ancient understanding of creation, not merely as the formation of material things out of nothing, but as an imposition, an order of functionality in a pre-existing chaotic state. So what does God do? We should be also thinking about it kind of, when we take that in consideration, we should be thinking about what does God do in the following days. He doesn't create stuff again from nothing. He's ordering it. He's giving purpose. He's separating names, assigning roles. He's bringing the sun into and the sun and moon into their functions. He's telling the land to bring forth food. He's giving humanity a task, a role to subdue. This isn't a story of God building the universe out of nothing, creating atoms and then everything else. It's a story of God turning a wild, desolate world into something else. A temple, if you will, a sacred space for life, meaning giving it meaning, a relationship. So what does Genesis 1:1 mean? It's not the modern headline that young earth creationists would like us to believe, where God creates a universe out of nothing in 0001 seconds. It's an ancient declaration. When God begins to create the heavens and earth, he's stepping into the chaos. He's bringing purpose to the purposeless. He's carving out a sacred space into the wild. He's turning a formless wasteland into a world where life could thrive. That's how the ancient Israelites would have heard it, how they would have viewed it anyways. And frankly, it's how we need to hear it, not by injecting young earth creationist view into the text, but by accepting what the text actually says in context of the people who lived it. Because this isn't just a story about then, it's really a story about now. God is bringing us order out of chaos. He still enters this broken world, and he's turning the ground into a holy ground, and he's still calling on you and me to be part of this mission. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this Bible study on verses 1 and 2, and hope it's shed some light and set things up for you for me to continue with the next following verses.